Could Invincible have existed on Prime if it wasn't for The Boys? Robert Kirkman actually gives us some detail in a recent interview with Deadline that he did, along with some interesting tidbits about the Conquest fight and some stuff for Season 4. We go over all that and more in today's video. So recently, Robert Kirkman sat down with Deadline to discuss some things about Invincible and how Season 4 was going along. He confirmed that Thrag has been cast, something that we already knew, but he still won't say who, along with going deeper into the Conquest fight, which he said was pretty much an all-hands-on-deck thing to animate. He was quoted as saying, "But yeah, the Conquest fight, production-wise, was an absolute bear. I mean, we had to get the extra board artists to come in and board extra scenes and work harder on smaller chunks of the episode. Which you usually have about 4 and 5 board artists that handle 5 to 8 minute chunks, and I think we had 6 or 7 board artists that were really doing 2 to 4 minute chunks, and so we definitely had an all hands on deck kind of effort to make sure that we got through the show. I think it was moved forward in the production schedule to give us more time to work on the episode. Not a surprise that the show's fights are getting more attention. As the series rolls on, and for anyone who's read the comics, they're only going to keep escalating from this point on. We have a lot of cool big battles that we have yet to see adapted. He was also asked about how it was adapting the comic to the show. Now, if you have been following this channel, you guys know that I've said that the adaptation is actually 1-for-1 with the comic, with some character swaps and updates for where it fits the story. Like for example, with the scene with Mark meeting the creator of Seance Dog at the convention, and updating the joke because the show is animated now instead of being a comic. To this, Robert said, "Now having the full Invincible series finished and also having the experience of dealing with this on The Walking Dead, there's a lot of decisions that were made on Invincible Season 1 through Season 3 that were made just in case we get to adapt the entire comic. So that when we're going to get to Season 5 and Season 6, if we're fortunate enough to do those, we know the track has been laid and things have been planned. So we can do that. We go from season to season, so the process of adapting the comic book into the show isn't getting more difficult because we've done the hard work of making sure that everything is where it needs to be." Robert's experience on The Walking Dead is key here. If you guys remember, the comic for The Walking Dead and the show were a bit different compared to, let's say, Invincible. This mostly comes from the fact that this was Robert Kirkman's first primetime TV show, and he was writing some episodes for the series too before he stopped after Season 5. If you know about the behind the scenes of The Walking Dead, the show had some rough behind the scenes stuff go on, like how the original showrunner, Frank Darabont, left the show after the first season because of AMC's meddling. It also resulted in a lawsuit that dragged on for years because AMC was trying to fiddle around with how much they were trying to pay him. And even later, Robert Kirkman and several other producers of the show also sued AMC because they were trying to screw with their royalties. Moral of the story is AMC is really cheap and is really trying their hardest to not pay people, which is scummy. But anyway, I don't think that Robert Kirkman is dealing with that garbage over at Amazon, because really, Amazon doesn't have an excuse. They're one of the most richest companies in the world. But they did admit that the budget for Invincible was lower than The Boys, which is why the animation for Invincible sometimes looks as wonky as it does, because they're saving their budget for the bigger episodes, but are also doing a year of season, so that doesn't help either. Speaking of The Boys, Robert was also asked about how they could get away with the violence being on Prime Video. And he basically said, "Content-wise, I feel fairly confident that we're okay on Prime Video, because we got to hide behind the trailblazing of The Boys, as they kept pushing the envelope every season. And so I get to watch that show and go, man, we can do anything." For Invincible, as long as there is an emotional payoff and a narrative reason for it to exist, I think that anything goes. This is the part that I found really interesting. Before The Boys, you really didn't have anything like it on Prime Video. With the freedom that streaming gives to creators, and considering that they don't have to abide by the same rules that network TV or cable TV do in self-censorship because they have to appeal to advertisers, they are allowed to show more crazy stuff in that context. So when The Boys starts the show off with having Huey's girlfriend get turned into paste and the deep assaulting Starlight in the very first episode, they kept pushing that envelope. When a show pushes boundaries and finds major success, it tends to change what's considered acceptable or even expected in mainstream entertainment. One of the clearest examples of that is Game of Thrones. Beyond just being a well-written fantasy series for the first 4 seasons, everything after that became pretty meh. It became known for its unapologetically adult content. We're talking graphic violence, political backstabbing, and a pretty liberal use of sex and nudity, almost to an extreme extent. And while that may have raised eyebrows in its early seasons, it ended up becoming part of what defined the show's identity and helped fuel its cultural dominance. Everyone was watching this show. And as a result, networks and streamers started asking for their own Game of Thrones. You started seeing more fantasy and sci-fi shows lean harder into darker themes and more explicit material, and morally complex characters. Shows like The Witcher, Westworld, and Vikings don't really shy away from gore or nudity because Game of Thrones showed that there was a huge audience for that kind of content, if it was grounded in strong world building and storytelling. It also really helps if your show doesn't have to tone it down because your show cuts to a commercial break after a guy gets his head bashed in with an axe, which advertisers would really prefer not to be associated with their brand. But I mean, it's more than just for shock value. In certain scenes of The Boys, the ridiculous moments are to really paint just how crazy people with powers are, and that they will push stuff to extremes, mostly played for shock value, and to get that feeling of, oh my god, what the f***? Like that season 3 opener where the guy shrinks down and goes all Ant-Man on the other guy. Sorry, I can't really explain that one in detail for fear of demonetization. I can't even really show you the footage, that's how wild it is. You're just gonna have to go check that thing if you know what I'm talking about. Season 3 episode 1, by the way. With Invincible, it's a little bit more reserved. When a character commits violence, there is a purpose behind it to elicit a reaction. Like when Omni-Man killed all the original members of the Guardians of the Globe. The episode showed no blood or nothing until the reveal of that scene. It specifically did not show any violence because it wanted to elicit the shock from you, the viewer, in that moment that Omni-Man, this Superman template that looks like he's the default strongest hero in the show, is actually a murdering villain. So the creators are showing you two things. This show isn't like the other animated hero shows that you would get from DC Animation or Marvel. And Omni-Man is actually a brutal villain that no one else knows about. And it's that philosophy of making the violence count that Invincible has pretty much carried forward, which is what makes it such a great show. And that's all I have for this topic, but before I go, I wanted to answer a mailbag question left to us by someone on one of my boys' videos. Remember, if you guys also want the chance to see your questions answered, leave them in the comments with #mailbag. This comes to us from VBNMC113. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, by the way. And they ask, #mailbag. What if Soldier Boy sees his grandson as someone who isn't far from saving? Thank you for the question, VB. For clarification, you're talking about Soldier Boy's relationship to Ryan as his grandfather, because Homelander is his son, and Soldier Boy hitting him during the season 3 finale, which led to Butcher and the rest of them fighting him. I'm assuming that's what you meant. Soldier Boy doesn't really have much of a relationship to Ryan other than being his grandfather. Even if he did kill Homelander and left him alive, I don't think that he would really care to raise him or anything. Remember, Soldier Boy sees Homelander as a failure, and thus he needs to take him out, which was part of his agreement to Butcher. He has no qualms about taking out his own blood, so by extension, I don't really think that he would even want to raise Ryan. Besides, Butcher and Mallory already had that part covered, so I think if Ryan never really interfered with the plan and they actually took out Homelander, then Soldier Boy would just move on with no contact with him. Remember, he's pretty far from the fatherly type. But that just about wraps it up for today's video. Remember to leave your mailbag questions down in the comments for us to answer, and I'll see you guys next time.